thanks everyone for spending a little time with me today. I'm sure some of you guys are coming off work and having a long day. So, my goal here for the next hour is to really provide to you as much information as I can to help you understand how to use a remote team member, why this model is happening now, and really to be a resource to all of you. So, I share with Lisa, I will have natural pauses through the presentation. And please, I want this to be as engaging as possible, and I'll certainly make myself available afterwards as well. So, just a little bit about me, just quickly. So, my background has always been in healthcare. I got my master's, my undergraduate from UC Berkeley. I did brain tumor for a little bit. I got my master's in health policy and management. I work with hospitals and clinics adopting IT and working with communities to really utilize healthcare and specialty care, and I did some work in telemedicine. I got into dentistry actually because my husband is a dentist and I helped him build his practice about 15 years ago. And that's really, I think, where this model was born. So I wanted to just share that context because I really what this presentation is about. It was also me sharing with all of you what we've been seeing at Swiss Monkey and also just how to really be successful in using a remote team member, because certainly this is not a new concept. And what we do here at Swiss Monkey is we connect practices all across the country with remote team members. So we provide the technology, the talent, et cetera. And so that's what we do. And I'm certainly happy to share more about that. And, for those of you who are interested. But again, today is really more about, if you're interested, how does this model really work? What are some of the pitfalls that we've seen and how to really optimize for success? Um, so I want to start off with a story because this is one of, I think, a really impactful story for me because this happened a couple of years ago after COVID, and I got this text Monday morning. It says here, Monday 8:20 in the morning, and I think some of you have gotten some of these text messages early in the morning before you get to work. But this was actually sent to me from a coach, and it said, "Hey Christine, happy Monday. I have an office in Cameron Park, and for those of you who don't know, Cameron Park is a little rural town up in Northern California. I also used to work there, but it's difficult to get staff. It's really kind of rural. Not a lot of people live up there." And she says, "I think you've helped them in the past. They are in crisis mode. The entire staff quit last week, and they are left with only one RDH. They need immediate help with front and back. Can you help us?" And I like to share this story because in the past, when something like this happens, I mean, if this happened 5 years, 10 years ago, this doctor would be in real big trouble. And I think with the rise of remote work and a lot of people being open to it and the technology being able to enable this kind of model, we were actually able to help this practice get back onto their feet within 2 days. And the way that we did that is that we can triage everything that's not patient facing off to an offsite team member. So if you think about anything that's not patient facing, we can remote into a practice management software. We can answer the phones. We can audit the schedules. We can present treatment plans. And so this is, I think, just one extreme example of how the remote model has really helped a private practice. And so I like to share this because I think it gives a lot of peace if you are a private practice doctor, and I've had this happen even within my own practice, is that sometimes things happen that just aren't expected, and you have to think about new models to be able to run your practice. And so that's what we'll really dig in today. And so this remote model, I think, enables a few things, and I want to talk about how it's going to make you more profitable, how you can enhance the productivity of your current team, because right now we know that there are already not enough people to do the jobs that we need in the dental practice in general in America. How do we reduce burnout? I think even after COVID, I mean, people are, there's a lot of pressure, I think, for the doctors and their teams to just get more done. And so the idea is, how do we do that when we already know that our team's overextended? But at the end of the day, you're a business, reimbursements are going down. You want to grow, you want to increase your production, and, you can only ask so much of your team. So how do you kind of rethink the operating model of your practice? And then I want to spend some real time here talking about, if you're interested in doing this, how do you actually do it, right? Like, what are the nuts and bolts? And I'm happy to be really open book about what we've seen so that you can be really successful in really adapting this model if that's of interest to you. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about let me just zoom out here in the sense of, like, why is outsourcing not new? I mean, this has been, Even 10 years ago, we heard of, dental practice and other healthcare organizations, thinking about outsourcing their billing, usually out to India or to the Philippines. And now we see a lot of doctors here. They're kind of being forced to think about this. There's certainly kind of this renaissance of remote businesses coming into play, a lot of people wanting to work from home. And this is what we call it kind of the Lollapalooza effect of like just kind of all these small little micro events happening in the environment, causing doctors to really think about, gosh, is this something that I really need to think about? And it's not. I don't think this stat's surprising that almost 1 out of 3 doctors are looking for admin staff. It continues to be a big issue. The ADA just mentioned that this staffing shortages are absolutely impacting your bottom line as a dental practice, and that not having enough team members can impact a practice up to 10%. And so for an average $1 million practice, that's $100,000 just by not being staffed properly, right? And we know that there's a rise in operational labor costs. We know everyone's asking for money. And like as I mentioned before, that they're right now, I think the stats are 2 to 3 times more jobs available than people that are available to work in the US. And so what do you do in that kind of case? And then kind of on the talent landscape, here's some other, I think, really important stats is that you're seeing this societal generation, and I'm going to talk a little about the next slide, is that this millennial Gen Z generation, they have a different expectation in terms of their relationship with work. And it kind of started to happen after COVID. But they're seeing this kind of this feel, and it happened a lot. It's already very prominent in the kind of the tech industry, but you're seeing this now kind of spill into other industries like healthcare, where people are like, gosh, I want to work from home. And so you're seeing this kind of increase in people saying, hey, is there a way for me to work from home a couple of days a week? And some people saying, hey, I want to work from home remotely, completely remote. We see a lot of parents and mothers and parents and kind of wanting to do this as well. There's a stat here saying that by 2027, which is just a blink away, that estimated 50% of the US workforce will be what we call freelancers or a gig worker. And for those of you kind of are like, what's a gig worker? It's essentially people who don't want to be a W-4. They don't want to be an employee. They want to be 1099s. They want to have control over their salary. They want to work from anywhere. They want to have the ability to kind of curate their work portfolio. And so you're seeing kind of this more independent feel to the talent workforce, which was very different than I think what you saw with the baby boomer generation, which is like really kind of, being patient and having like one job and staying with that job for a long period of time. I think we're really starting to see that change after COVID. So if you're seeing that, like, gosh, staffing and hiring feels different, is because it is. And that even now with AI, up to 70% of tasks will be automated by AI. I mean, that's a whole different conversation which we can get into, but certainly there's a lot of work here in terms of like, hey, where does AI come into play? Where do we have the kind of quote human in the loop, and how do we overall increase effectiveness in the practice? Um, I want to talk about the generational impact, because I think if anyone's doing staffing, I want you to know you're not alone here. And this, again, this is 1981 and younger, and this is a really different type of generation. They're digitally native, which means that they grew up with cell phones in their hand, right? So this is the one that they want to get paid more, they want to get promoted faster. The days, again, I use the baby boomer generation as kind of the example here of like when you work in the post office for 10 years, you wait to get promoted, you kind of wait your turn. That is not this generation. And I've had people, when we used to do clinical staffing, 3 months into the job, they would ask for a raise, right? Or they leave. And what we call it, they kind of vote with their feet. If they don't get what they want, they know that there's plenty of other opportunities out there for them. So it's a very different type of fabric in terms of what it looks like for an employer. So it feels different because it is different. It's just it's a different kind of generation that's now working. And so they just have a different relationship. And I think the idea of this kind of the social media aspect of it, I think we're starting to see really what that means in the dental office, because especially where, this generation, they're used to kind of going in and out of conversations with a touch of a button on Instagram, on Facebook, on TikTok, right? They can enter and exit with just kind of like clicking out, saying a few words here and there with a few emojis. And I think that's all fine and great until you get to a dental practice where you have to talk to patients with high anxiety and they don't have that emotional intelligence. They don't know how to really communicate. And so it becomes this kind of weird kind of societal burden as to who is the one that's going to do the training. And again, that impacts employers these days, because now you've got this next generation who has a different expectation with a job, and also might not have the communication skills that we really want them to have, especially in a industry like dentistry. And I still use this term, the Great Resignation, but it's probably more like, I think they call it the Great Reshuffling now. But interestingly enough, there's still stats to say, hey, that 1 out of 3 people are willing to leave their job without another one in place. And I just spoke to an IT person who runs this national company, and he's saying that he sees doctors all the time where like, they were just about to open their practice and someone just left. I mean, it was just, and they didn't even have another one in place. And that's very different than what it was, before COVID, which is how do people used to look for jobs? They would take a sick day, they would go interview, and then they would kind of give their 2 weeks. And now I think we see sometimes that professionalism is out the window, and some of them are just willing to leave, and sometimes without even a job in place. And so the question is, with all of these different aspects, how are you supposed to run a dental practice, right? How do you run a small business when we're really used to kind of full-time employees really being there? It's really kind of be present within the 4 walls of the practice. And so I think it's those combination of factors, along with kind of, pressure on insurance, people wanting to work more, et cetera, that doctors are really considering, gosh, is there another way to run my business? And the answer is yes. And so in the traditional sense, this is kind of what it looks like, right? We have everything done on site, check in, check out, all the scheduling, the treatment presentation, your billing cycle, obviously all the clinical aspects, answering phones. And most of you, I would kind of guess here, you're doing what I call a micro experiment offsite, which is your accountant probably is not on site on your team, your coaches, if you're doing marketing or legal. So some of you are already doing this level of kind of this hybrid model. We're probably not thinking about it that way when you think about the structure of your team. But this hybrid model is essentially asking you to think about, if you were to extend that kind of that framework out into the operational sense, what does that look like? And so the majority of my practices and a lot of people are saying, hey, if it's not patient facing, can we do it offsite? And the answer is yes. It doesn't mean that you should, right? Just because you have a hammer doesn't mean you have a nail. It means that you can. And again, like in that example that I gave to you, where it's kind of like a break the glass scenario, you can take things offsite. And after COVID, we had practices absolutely where they're like, hey, no one came back in, the doctors didn't hire back. We took everything offsite. And then we kind of brought back in as needed. So this is kind of what that theme looks like. And I think if you can understand the thesis around the hybrid model, it's a pretty cool playground for you to play with as a CEO of your practice, right? So anything like this is, I think most of my practice fall somewhere in this kind of hybrid where they take some concepts of their on-site team in terms of what they want them to focus on, and then outsource everything else that they don't need. Now, again, in some cases where maybe it's a startup, I have some practices in Hawaii, really rural areas where it's difficult to, maybe high price of living. They may say, hey, everything is done offsite except for the check, obviously maybe the dental assistant or the doctor's checking in, and then the doctor's doing kind of all the treatment plans. Those are some of my like prosthodontic office. Some of these smaller offices tend to do something like this, or if they're a startup, this is pretty aggressive. You can do this, and I think for those of you who are maybe, I just had a doctor text me and just saying, hey, they're feeling like they're taken hostage because someone wants like a $50 front office position. Certainly, you can take this model and kind of tap into talent outside of the 4 walls if you need to. But I would say the majority of practices think about some level like this where they're just saying, hey, I want my core team on site to focus on these things. This is the stuff that's keeping them from doing all the work I need them to do. And then they kind of pick and choose. And what's great if you do this properly is that you should be able to have a model here where you can kind of tap in and out of this ecosystem of kind of the hybrid world as you need to, because as your practice goes, you're going to need different things. And so as you're coming and thinking about this model, you want some flexibility. You want to have a partner where you can kind of grow, because there are going to be times where like, hey, we're good. You want to take a lot of things on site. And then if someone leaves, where if some of you have, some of you might only have one person in the front. And the challenge with that, and that's because maybe for whatever reason, there's a variety of different reasons, right? But if that person leaves, all the intellectual property goes with that office manager. And worst case scenario is that, as again, I kind of use, they take you hostage, and they say, hey, this is what I want, or else. And so in those kinds of scenarios, you're kind of in a vulnerable position. And this is where kind of an offsite team member can help with some of the, minimizing some of the risk and balancing out, and just giving you an option as to like, hey, what are my options in case something happens? And certainly this is something where you can give me a call. We've had a lot of those incidents where someone just leaves, there's no 2-week notice. And what's great, as traumatic as that is that We've done that a ton of times, and there's plenty of resources, including our own, that can help you during those times of need. And that just wasn't the case, 10 years ago. And so what I love about the hybrid model, and I think the concept here that we're really thinking about, is this idea of resiliency, right? Like most of our practices were small business, one or two people in the front. We are not staff, I think, like some of the emergent groups, DSOs, where they have layers where they can pull someone from location 13 and pull them back to help with your practice. Most of you have exactly the amount of people you need to run your business. It gives us very little margin for staffing disruptions, right? If you're understaffed, someone's gone, that's 50% of your team being the front. So we're in a position where we're just at a high risk place. And so the hybrid model allows you to have some insurance plan around what that looks like. Let me just pause really quick. Are there any questions? At least you can screen them out if there are. Otherwise, I'll just keep on going.
I don't see any right now.
Okay, fantastic. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the use cases, and we'll talk more about how to actually do this. And so when I think about when people use kind of an offsite team member or a team, sometimes you just need someone for a part-time thing. So you might need just like you just bought a practice, you've got $500,000 of aging, and you actually don't need someone full-time. You just need something very specific for a project, or there's a maternity coverage. Rather than having your on-site team spend extra hours, take up, overtime, feel stressed out on these kind of things, you might want to consider using an off-site team member, especially when it's just like this is kind of a very succinct project. There's kind of a start and end date. That might be something where you're just like, hey, let's bring somebody in who knows what they're doing, get this taken care of, and you don't really need them afterwards. So that's one use case of kind of the remote team member, is that these very succinct projects, maybe someone's going, again, maternity leave, sick leave, especially if they're planned out, that's a great time to be able to bring somebody in, because you don't want to add extra overhead because you have a short-term need, right? If someone's gone for 3 months, you also need to run your practice. The show must go on. But you also don't want to be so understaffed where they come back and it's like a crazy mess. So that's, I think, one certainly certain use cases that we see this model really being played into. The other time is kind of just part-time help. I would say the majority of practices that I know, this is what they're using. Because if you think about it, if you break down what happens in the front, a lot of things don't need a full-time person, right? I mean, there's like certain things like accounts receivable, maybe your outbound hygiene recare calls, your reservation reminders. If you start to think about what are the specific tasks in the front desk, most of them fall between 5 to 25 hours a week. And I think about if I were to give that back to your team, what does that look like? So you can talk to your team saying, hey, if I outsource certain things, what can they do? And that's kind of the conversation you want to have with them. And so most of the things I see my private practice doctors using are these kind of fractional units of labor, which is like, again, 5 to 25 hours a week of just extra help. And you'll be surprised how much that relieves off the front desk and how much work you can do by just giving your team 10 extra hours a week, right? And for some of my startups, I just use it 5 days a month, right? So what's great is that you can now think about really having a staffing resource for yourself. That's kind of the Goldilocks, right? You don't just get stuck with your 1 employee or 2 FTE or 3 FTE, and then you have this kind of half-time FTE. You don't really need that. You're kind of at that weird place. And so now I think with this model, you can really start to customize what your staffing needs look like and then be able to meet whatever those gaps are. And then certainly there are some full-time options. We don't see this a lot, but this happens when someone leaves. So, right, like you're, again, one or two people in the front, and there's it's a role-based kind of situation, and that person is your insurance coordinator, your financial coordinator, your scheduling coordinator, and certainly certain things like that. That's a full-time position. But again, I think the idea here is you can see the thesis of what this model looks like, which is like, gosh, you can use this for contract time, contract work, part-time, and full-time. And you want to find a partner where you have the ability to flow back and forth, because as a private practice, things do change and you have different needs. And so you want to be able to identify what that looks like for you, and you want to be able to customize it based on what your individual organization needs at that time. So I like to kind of have I like put this up here because these are some of the things my doctors have shared with me, where it's like, this is what it actually sounds like in the office in terms of like, hey, when they trigger, I need someone remotely, which is like, we see this, right before the beginning of the day, where like, I can't come in for whatever reason. If someone got in a car accident, someone's out sick, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things where you think about, okay, do I need a remote team member to come in? They need to give their 2 weeks. Sometimes then I hope that they give their 2 weeks. I've been hearing actually more and more people not give their 2 weeks, and it's like they give the notice on a Friday or like on the phone. So ideally, you have the 2 weeks that you can do the transition. I always want to iterate like if you don't get the 2 weeks and someone just leaves, it's gonna be okay. And I hear a lot of doctors like, oh my gosh, they don't want to outsource because their office manager, they do it a very specific way, and this is how we do it. And whenever I hear that, I chuckle a little bit because there are best practices and there's certain ways that like the industry does it. And so I want to be really, when you hear that, you want to be a little wary. Like, why is your practice doing it a very certain way? There are certainly kind of like benchmarks of how we do it. Certainly, there might be a few ways where you do certain write-offs, et cetera. But in general, if you have a practice or a colleague where someone leaves, most practices there's kind of a blueprint that we can follow, and in worst case scenario we can reset passwords. So I think I like to share that with my doctors because I know sometimes it feels really nerve-wracking when you're like, oh my gosh, I can't not lose this person, and then you kind of get stuck in this corner. You're not quite sure what to do if you get that notice or they decide to leave. um, no one's picking up the phone. We don't have time. You know, I hear this a lot, right? It's like, and usually what they want is more team members. So I think when you hear kind of those excuses of like, hey, you want to double your production, and your team says, I don't have time. That should be in your mind. If I gave them an assistant and I added someone just for a few hours a day, will my team have time to actually do the work that you need them to do? Which is what I hope is like, you really want your team to be focused on, especially with, I think the labor shortages. I want the on-site team to be focused on providing that Ritz-Carlton service, that five-star experience. I think now I I think patients are looking for that. They're paying more for their health care these days, more for their dentistry, and they certainly want to have a practice that pays attention to who they are. And if they're coming in and your front desk is like, oh my gosh, I'm on the phone, and they've been on the phone with their favorite insurance company for 40 minutes to get this breakdown, no one is hanging up. I'll tell you that. Like if your front desk is on the phone, they've committed the 40 minutes of their life waiting for a breakdown. If your new patient comes in or someone's coming out with a high, a large treatment plan, they're going to stay on the phone. It's just, and it affects your patient experience. So you want to think about, where do you want to invest your resources? Where do you want your front office team to really be focused? And they're burnt out. And the idea is you want them to do less. And I actually know this practice in a company where like their whole concept here is like, the phone doesn't even ring. I had one doctor like, I don't even want to hear the phone ring. Like they have one person in front, and that person's only job is to provide a really high-end experience. And they want it to feel more like a plastic surgery kind of office where like they're just like, do you want some tea? Do you want some water? And just showing them around the office, giving them a tour, and everything else, the phone's ringing, etc. They're like, the doctor's like, I don't want to hear the phone ring. And so she's outsourced everything, and everything happens in the back, and kind of all the Disneyland stuff happens in the front. So I think doctors kind of, you really have fun with this if you have a really clear idea of like what you want this to look like. And again, collection rates are under 98. If you're not hitting your benchmarks, certainly these are things, if your on-site team isn't getting them done, that's also another place where you can like look at, hey, how do I contract with someone off beyond the four walls of my office to get this done? And what's nice is that for most businesses that are doing kind of third party services like this, is that it's a pure expense for you, meaning you're not hiring these individuals as an employee. And I'm in California, and I'll tell you, it's not super fun here to onboard and offboard an employee. We have a lot of labor laws here around like 6 hours, and you got to do a 10-minute break. It just it's a little bit of a circus we have to play over here. And so one of, I think, the benefits that you don't have to do a lot of that stuff typically with a third party service, right? Like it's a pure expense. You pay what you pay, and if you want to fire them and it doesn't work out, it is what it is, and you don't have to go through kind of all the employee headaches, and all the benefits. So that is, I think, one of the perks that some of my offices say they really like about this model. Now, my doctors ask me like, is this going to cost me less? And I say, it depends on how you look at it, right? So I just say like, look, it's not just about, if you're going to add a remote person, a remote professional, even a remote business, you're going to be adding an expense. And so the idea here is if you're saying, hey, I'm going to hire Lisa here for 10 hours to do insurance verification, and now you've added this kind of this expense to your P&L, there's a couple of things that need to happen. Now you're basically saying, hey team, guess what? I've hired this person, and now we have an extra 10 hours of work of time that we have available in the office. What are we going to do with that time? And the idea here is that you're also increasing your top line, right? So that's how your margins go up. It's not just like whenever you add an expense, if you're not actually producing more, what's the point? Now you actually just made less. You're actually decreasing your margin. So the idea here is one, hopefully you can save a little bit more because when you have a specialized person, ideally instead of them spending 20 hours to do claims and billing and all that for your office, if that's the only thing they're doing, hopefully they can do that in 75% of the time so that you're saving money there. But two, in addition to that component of them being able to specialize and do that more quickly, is that your on-site team can then focus on the things that are actually generating production for your office, right? So anything really not patient-facing, not generating revenue, the insurance verification, maybe the reservation reminder calls, the billing cycle, some of those components I like to put offsite just because they are really important, but they're not patient facing. And it's really like if they're in the if they're in the kind of the corner office, then what's the point of them? It's you can pull that offsite, and your on-site team should really be kind of patient facing. They should be helping you schedule to goal. They should be following up with your unscheduled treatment. That's really where I think that's where you want them to focus on because you can't absolutely. We've had offices here where they're like, hey, I hired somebody, they're brand new, they're on site, but they have no dental experience. And in that case, maybe then you want to take an offsite person who knows dentistry. They're the ones that are going to call your unscheduled treatment. They're the ones that are going to help fill your schedule. That's not typically the case. That happens sometimes. The majority of the time is you don't want to outsource your most challenging thing, right? You want the things that are simple, easy. You want to minimize the risk of this model going wrong. So that's something that's really important is that when you do this, you don't want to outsource the most difficult thing, which is, really unscheduled treatment should absolutely stay on site. That's where you want your team. They saw the patient come in, they saw the patient come out. They know kind of the barriers to that. And so you want to keep those kind of things on site. You want your team to really do that. And then things that are lower risk, more that are, I think, uh, not patient facing, that's the stuff that I think make a lot more sense to outsource. Again, it's a highly reflexive model because it depends on your team because some of you might have a really strong team and all they need help is with answering their phones. That's it. Like they don't want, they had everything else under control. Some of you on the phone on the meeting today might actually have a really young junior team, maybe some startups where they're like, "Hey, I don't actually have a really experienced team." Your offsite team then might be your specialist. So what's fantastic about this again is that you now have a whole kind of, kind of the world is your oyster in this sense, and that you have an entire talent pool that you didn't traditionally have access to now available, right? Because now you have no geographic barriers. You can get people all across the globe, and you see a lot of our DSO enterprise clients. They're actually going up, overseas to do some of their care, which is fine. But again, it just depends on you. But the idea here is now you're not constrained to whoever is 20 miles within your office, because now it's like with remote work, you can actually access talent all across the globe, all across the US. And you can sometimes, for those of you who are living, and I don't know where everyone's coming from, if you live in a high wage area, you could also take advantage of some of the labor differentials as well. So I see some of especially my California doctors, they get excited about it. And those are living in like less expensive areas also get excited about being able to match that kind of difference. So certainly I think lots of really interesting dynamics happening with the remote model. And so again, it's not just about your bottom line, it's also increasing your top line, because the last thing I would want you to do is just add an expense, make less money, which is that's not the point of this at all. Like, I mean, obviously you want your team to have more joy and you want to have less headaches, but you're still a business and I want to make sure that you're actually increasing your top line and you're making more money. So I like to give this example is like, what could the extra 5 hours a week, and I'm saying usually a professional is around, if you have a US based professional and they're usually asking for between 22 to 27 bucks an hour, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, depending on where they're living. But the idea here is if you can say, hey, I'm going to take some of the work that you're doing that's not patient facing, offload it to somebody off site. What can your team do? And just some examples here of what we've seen some practices do where they're scheduling more crowns. We had one doctor, they're doing a lot more cosmetic cases. Case acceptance has gone up. They're going through unscheduled treatment. And so there are certainly things here that you can say, hey, you want them to focus on things that are going to add production to your practice. Let me pause. Any questions there? And again, how many calls are you missing? This, I would say answering the phones is absolutely one of the biggest things, especially during your business hours. And After hours, after hours, I just had a doctor ask me like, should I be answering my calls after hours? Like at the minimum, I would say you should probably have someone answering your calls up to like 7, 8 o'clock. I mean, afterwards, I mean, usually you don't, emergency patients, they're usually your existing patients. They're not usually new patients. Sometimes they're new patients. I find that most of new patients, they'll just go onto onto your website, schedule an appointment, put out a form. So I don't see a ton of new patients calling like after 10 o'clock. They usually just go on the website. Typically, kind of late hour calls tend to be existing patients, but if I'm wrong and you guys are seeing something different, please let me know. But at least during business hours, you should be answering your calls. So that's like 7 a.m. to like 8 p.m. And so at that time, you might just say, hey, Christine, I just need someone to answer calls from like whatever, 7 to 9 whenever you open. And maybe if you close at 5, 5 to 8. So that's where it's kind of fun, where you can have these kind of fractional units of labor, just answering calls when you need to, or maybe during lunch. If some of you close during lunch, that's certainly something that you can do as well. Because what we found is that most 75% of missed calls are just never returned for whatever reason. And the patient's back at work, they had this very limited amount of time to talk to you, and now they're gone. So if you're not going to do the full kind of 24-hour kind of call service, at least do kind of that 12-hour shift. We're seeing a lot of the big DSOs being able to cover that shift. So I want that, private practice. I think now you have some of the resources to be able to offer that. I know it's really hard. You don't want to push your team to, you have kind of the additional 8, 9 hour workday. So those additional, 3 or 4 hours, no one wants to work them, but you should answer the phones. And I see a lot of missed calls happening like right when you close, or usually, 30 minutes before your office close. I see a lot of the team members just kind of zone out. They don't want to answer the phone call. They're tired, and then typically the perk in their step isn't as great anyway. So not sure if you want them to answer your calls. So 4:30 to 7 or 8 is a good time to consider, should I add somebody there just to answer those calls, because people are getting off work. They maybe are thinking about their dentistry. They didn't have time to call. So you want to answer those calls. And so again, that's what I would recommend, and maybe a few hours beforehand, just so that your team isn't like coming into like a deluge of like new phone calls. Okay, so let's talk about how to integrate a remote team member. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts. Um, so before you add anyone else on to an offsite team or on your team, you want to just ask, do you have the right team? Are they in the right seats, right? Because typically we're really good when you're interviewing a new person, you're really good at assessing whether or not they're the right fit. But then once they're the incumbent, sometimes you take a scheduling coordinator, you promote them to an office manager, and that's just like, they're not good at that, right? It's called the Peter principle, where you take someone who is really good at scheduling or treatment planning, and now they're an office manager and they suck as an office manager. So the first thing you do before you add anything is like, do you have the right team, and where do you want to go, and are they in the right seats, right? Because if you can hit your financial goals without having to add new people, and just more like you getting some coaching and maybe some systematic changes, I always prefer that. I don't want you to add overhead. I have a dental practice too. Like, why would you do that? So I think before you do that, you want to kind of assess from a strategic perspective, where do you want to go? Do you have the right team? Then are they in the right seats? And have you trained them to be in the new seats if you are moving things around? And if they aren't, then that's where you kind of want to start to think about, okay, what kind of new talent do I need to get me to where I want to go? And so this is kind of the process that we take our doctors through, and I think a lot of this is what I would recommend for you before you kind of, if you're excited and thinking about this model, is before you add anyone new, is like, where do you want to go? What is your vision? And you need to be really crystal clear about this before you add new people, and you want to have good systems, et cetera, and you want to know what you need done. And typically, um, the conversation we have is like, we want our teams to be engaged, and we want it to be a synergistic kind of everyone rowing in the same direction. So, typically the conversation is like, hey, we're producing $150,000 a month. We want to hit 200. How do we get there? And you can ask your team before you add anybody else. And if your team again says, hey, yes, we can do this, we have to do just XYZ, but we don't have to add any new people, we don't need to do anything differently, then you should just go that way, right? I like to use financial metrics because it's agnostic, and it's like, you either hit it or you don't hit it. Typically, what ends up happening is when you hit those goals, you start to see your team kind of like raises their hand that says, hey, we want to do it, but guess what? I actually don't have time to call all those unscheduled patients. I don't have time to do any marketing. I don't have time to put those things on the internet and for the cosmetic cases or whatever it is. And then from your end as a doctor, you want to start taking inventory of all those things that are keeping your team from doing all the stuff that you want them to do, right? Which is again, making sure that everyone is going out with a treatment plan, everyone is scheduling to goal, et cetera, some of those revenue generating tasks. And so once you start to get an inventory of all the stuff that they can't do, and typically, again, it's a lot of it stuff is very time consuming, right? They might say, hey, doctor, I really want to do it, but I am sending out claims and posting all these checks is taking up a ton of time. And it does actually, like if none of you have done billing before, when you are starting a Delta check, you actually just can't stop. Like you actually have to finish the entire posting and then move on to the next thing. So there is some truth there. Like some of those processes absolutely take up a lot of time and you need to be very detail oriented about it. And so if that's what your team is taking time on, they need to kind of context set there. It's really hard for them to then also go through and like go through all your unscheduled treatment. So you want to think about where are they spending their time and you want to play Tetris a little bit and say, hey, guess what? If I were to give you an assistant, can we do X, Y, Z? And that's kind of the conversation you want to have. It's like, what is the vision? What are the specific tasks you want to outsource, the specific roles? And then you can actually start to, to figure out what kind of talent you need. So once you have your vision, and you have an idea of what you want to get, you're also going to need the technology infrastructure. So the idea here is that, and I'll go through the next piece is that when someone is offsite, it's not just them remoting in, right? You definitely want some tech around that professional to make sure they're not using their cell phones, they're not using their home computer that their children or their husband or your wife are using. You want to make sure they're not at Starbucks, calling your patients, and you want to make sure there's some kind of real-time messaging between off and on-site. So certainly there's lots of different companies that can provide that for you, or you can curate your own, and I can certainly provide some resources there if you need to. But there is certainly some tech to make sure like that remote professional is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're doing it in a HIPAA compliant fashion, and that your on-site team understands what they're actually doing off-site, so that there's a good communication flow between both teams, because that's, I think, where it gets really tricky when the offsite team member is just doing what they want to do and they're sending out a couple of emails and there just isn't a really good kind of fluid communication. You really want to get that you really want to get that titrated and make sure you got that dialed in. So you got the technology, you connect to your talent. That's really important. And what I found with some doctors is sometimes they feel like they can just, all right, Lisa, you're on here. And Lisa, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you. But you're on here, and like here's you're remoted to my practice management and go. And the doctor and the team just sleep. That is not how this works, and that is probably one of the biggest barriers and I think challenges that I see a lot of my doctors who try to use this model is that they don't onboard their professional or their business, whoever they're using properly. Every office is different. So if there's a specific way that you want to schedule, a specific deposit you take for new patients, how do you handle patients who haven't been in a year and a half? What do you do with like patients who have a balance? You want to orient your professional to make sure that your on-site experience is similar to your off-site. You really want to keep that patient experience really sacred from on-site to off-site. So that's really important that first 30 days, slow it down a little bit and make sure you set up your professional for success. So ideally you have good systems in place. You have a kind of a place where all of your passwords, et cetera, are taken care of. We certainly have tech that can help you do that, but you don't want to just leave them in there and then you're like, I don't know why they didn't succeed. Well, I mean, if we just kind of put them in there and you just kind of hope that they knew what they're doing, that can be a challenge, right? Now, again, if you're already starting, like, I have no idea, I need someone to help me kind of get my front desk in order, then you want to make sure that whoever you're offloading that to already has experience doing this. So you just want to make sure that you are providing some imprinting around your practice to make sure that they're set up to actually do what you want them to do, and that your patients, they might know they're offsite, but that it feels like a very similar experience, especially like how they answer the phones. If your offsite team member is doing it, you don't want them answering the phones differently than on your onsite team. Now, again, that leads kind of more the management and training. I do like quality assurance. So I know we're already kind of understaffed in the front, but you certainly like at least, once a quarter, maybe ideally once a month, especially at the beginning, is like you're checking in with your team member. How are you doing? You want to create an open space, and you always want to make sure that professional has open communication with you just to make sure things are going well, right? The last thing you want is like 2 months later, like, why do I have $30,000 worth of claims that haven't been sent? That always lies back on the office because you guys, that is the managing component. So there are certain quality assurance systems in place for many for many businesses. So you do want to ask about what that looks like for them. But you ultimately, like, this is your practice, you're the CAO, and I'm saying you certainly want to make sure that you are checking in to make sure like that things are actually moving the way that you want them to move. And then communication and feedback. Again, once they kind of get, usually the first 90 days, that's where a lot of like you're working out the kinks, you're seeing if it's a good fit, you're seeing where there are breakdowns in your workflow, in your systems. So I think absolutely one of the things that happens when you have an offsite team member is it highlights where things are broken in your practice, because now you have multiple, chefs in the kitchen. And if you guys aren't documenting your notes, you don't put your clinical notes in there, you're not scheduling, you don't have blocks to schedule your emergency patients, things can get really messy. And so it kind of can feel painful at the beginning. But for me as a practice, like I certainly, you got to face it head on. It's better for you to know, like, hey, here are where we have kind of weaknesses in our workflows, and let's go ahead and tackle them. So it does kind of force you to address some of those issues in terms of the systematic kind of layout of your practice. I know that's a lot, but it's certainly something where it's not just this innovation isn't like exchanging glove brand A for glove brand B. It's not that kind of innovation in healthcare. The remote model is really breaking a lot of things and kind of putting together a new operating system for your practice. So it's a different type of commitment when you do this. But I'll tell you, most of my practices that have done this, they never go back. In fact, once they kind of say, oh, they got through the first one, they actually add more hours, they add more people. And some of them really just have kind of minimal front office team members. So I think if you can, when you come into this, you're committing to this process, knowing that, hey, at the beginning could be a little bumpy. There's going to be changes. You're going to be communicating, on real-time messenger. You're going to be having a lot of phone calls. You want to make sure your systems are in place. It's a little bumpy at the beginning, right? Because you are breaking the system, you're changing expectation and behavior. But if you can get through that and you're expecting that, I think you can really optimize the resiliency of your practice. Because I'll tell you, other practices with larger organizations are already doing this, and I want to make sure that you have the competitive advantage that you deserve. Most of you are private practice, there are certainly things that we are just we don't have access to traditionally than larger organizations. Okay. I want to spend a little more time here. So top challenges, I think we talked about this. Team buy-in. I know as a doctor, you are the CEO of your practice, but I'll tell you, whenever you add a remote team member in there, you add somebody in the mix and your team isn't bought in, I've seen a really high failure rate, because typically what ends up happening is the on-site team does kind of have priorities. So if you want to make sure, if you're interested in doing this, that you do have team buy-in, we can certainly help you with discussions, or whoever you're working with can help you with how do you really adopt this model, because you don't want to pretend you're not hearing your team. The reality is, like, a lot of on-site team members are really nervous about remote professionals. They're nervous about, is this person taking my job? Which no one's trying to take their job. There's enough work for everybody. But I think as a CEO, you want to be really respectful, and you want to make sure, like, hey, you want to optimize their time, right? Like they're so valuable to your practice. The last thing you want them to do is things that aren't a good use of their time. Like, you want their expertise focused on building your practice, increasing your production. You don't want them doing things like insurance verification. It's not a good use of their time. So you really want to optimize their skill set to do things that are both good for them and good for you. And I think they should be rewarded for that. So there's certainly kind of economic ways that you can have the conversation, saying, hey, guess what? If I don't have to pay you X amount of money, and actually I can outsource this to someone less expensive, and it's a pure expense, maybe then you have a new kind of compensation incentive program where it's like you can take that difference and you can actually add it to the team bonus. So certainly ways that you can generate team buy-in that's also financial, because typically it should be saving you money, if not also producing more for you. Managing expectation, adapting to change. Again, letting your team know, and also for you as you're coming in here as a CEO, is that it gets a little, it can feel a little bumpy, right? And you want to just take the time to kind of embrace it, because it takes a little time, because you're going to be asking a lot of questions about how do we schedule? Like, why don't we have a scheduling protocol? Why don't we have blocks? Why are we not documenting our notes? I see a lot of times with practices with one office manager, it just happens, right? Like the office manager, and maybe it's a spouse, just we're on the phone, we're not documenting everything on the notes, because it's like, I'm the only person up here. Why do I have to document like what the financial plan is? The challenge is now when you add more people, if that person leaves, like what happens? So it actually, for you as a CEO, I think really helps, because now you're like, everyone has to be on the same page. I want everything documented. I want all the intellectual property of my practice and my patients inside of some kind of software, some kind of tech. because you don't want to be dependent on one person. I think that's the most difficult part about running the practice, is that typically it's like one person has so much knowledge, and it's like we're highly over indexed on that one person, and we just want to minimize that. It's not necessarily bad. We want to hedge some bets there in case something happens, maybe they get sick or whatever it is, decide to leave, that the impact of that transition isn't so bad. Onboarding and training, we talked a little bit about that. You want to spend a little time orienting your professional. If you don't have the expertise to do that, there are plenty of people who can help you. So again, I think I should have put the slide up there. It's like your job is not to do everything. My job here is to kind of give you an overview of how this works. And there are certainly tons of resources. You don't need to know everything in the front. I think that's you want to focus on the clinical expertise. But you certainly want a resource to help with the onboarding flow, the front office kind of systems and best practices. And we can certainly give you resources to do that. That should not be a secret. So if your office manager is telling you we do it a certain way, you just want to know like that's not necessarily the case. There's certainly ways that we can help support you there. Scheduling and workflow integration. It just feels different when you have an offsite team member, because everyone's communicating on some kind of real-time messaging software. Maybe there's a phone call that comes in, especially if they're answering the phone and they're like, hey, guess what? I have an emergency patient. I'm trying to schedule them, but there's no 30-minute block. Where do I put them? So certainly there's kind of an adaptation time where like the on-site team is trying to adapt to what the offsite team member is doing. Again, it depends on what your offsite team is doing. If they're doing insurance verification, that might be less of a disruption or impact to your workflows. Again, just kind of depends. And then accountability and performance tracking. So that's, I think, one of the things here that I do want to share is that I'm screenshotting what we do. So for us, like we track like certain KPIs, how many claims you send, et cetera. Because as a practice owner, I want to know what I'm paying for. The reality is like the person's offsite. I do trust them to an extent, but I want to know like, hey, if I spend $1,000 a month on this person, like what are they actually doing? So whatever company you work with, you do want to make sure like there's some kind of tracking mechanism, some kind of software where they're like, how am I assessing the productivity of this person? So that's really, really key. And again, for us, like we have them actually submit a productivity log. I don't know if all the other companies do that, but you can certainly ask. Like again, part of what you want to do is at the beginning, like, look, what are the things? How do we track performance? And if I were you, I would have them submit a productivity log, whether it's through email or whatever it is, or they can use this platform. Is that you want to say, hey, what did you do at the end of the day? Let me know. And then, how many calls you made, how much production did you schedule for us? It just creates things so that the conversations are agnostic, right? So if you need to say, hey, I hired this person 8 hours a day to answer calls, and there's only 2 calls, maybe you want to add more to the workload, or maybe you want to reduce whatever that call time span is. So again, the idea is we want to give you real data to be able to act on, and not just feeling, because sometimes when you're so busy and it's like, I'm just feeling really overwhelmed. And it also allows the professional to feel really proud about what they did, right? Because then they can say, hey, guess what, doctor? You spent $1,000, but guess what? I scheduled you $20,000 of Invisalign this month, right? And it gives them something if they want to have a raise or whatever it is. It's really a conversation that's data backed versus like your emotion of how you're feeling with that person. So just a couple of things as you are exploring the kind of the deluge of different outsourced companies out there. A couple of questions: what kind of training do they provide? What kind of QA measures? Do they have experience in the field? There are some that don't have dental experience. It doesn't mean they're bad. You should just know, like, hey, is it a general call center? Is it something that's specific to dentistry? We obviously have a lot of high anxiety patients. Maybe you're selling high-end cases. So you want to know who's answering your phone, because absolutely, aside from your website, how that phone is answered absolutely makes a difference on the patient experience. Contract length is really important, because it's like if you got stuck with a 12-month contract and you want to get out, what do you do? What level of customization? A lot of my private practices, they want the ability to customize how I answer the phone. Some of these services don't. They're like, this one person is answering calls for 5 different people. They're like, they get the name, the phone number, and this is it. So if that's important to you, you want to know ahead of time. And then references, I think that's really helpful in terms of like, hey, I want to know what's it been like for your other clients. And then in terms of investment models, a variety: hourly, some of them are flat monthly costs, some of them are, call plus a base. Sometimes they're just like, hey, we pay by outcome. Sometimes it's a management fee, and kind of a hybrid. So you want to start to ask those questions just so you know what you're getting involved with, and that way you're your bill at the end of the month, it doesn't go from like $500 a month to 2,000. Unless you're doing a great month. I mean, I'm not opposed to that, right? If you have a great month, I expect your variable rate in terms of the labor cost to go up a little bit. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just want to know what that looks like. So again, the benefits of remote model, kind of just wrapping out, is one, it allows your team to focus on specific tasks. You don't want them, especially if you're in higher labor costs, you're paying your people a lot of money plus their benefits, etc. You don't want them doing things that you can pay somebody offsite to do, I think, less in a less expensive way. You want your person to really maximize their talent. And that's what I say is like, I don't want them doing things that aren't kind of, hitting the peak of their scope of work. You want them to be pushed. You want them to earn more. And you do that by having them do what is kind of the most profit generating aspect of their skill set. It's cost effective. Again, these aren't usually employees. If you choose your partner correctly, these are kind of pure expenses. A lot of these companies allow you to kind of have just on a part-time fractional units of labor, so you don't need to necessarily hire a full-time person. Again, your idea is to reduce your overhead by also increasing your top line. So because we talked about, obviously we're very susceptible to changes in your workflow. Workforce continuity is absolutely competitive advantage. Like you want to figure out how to minimize those disruptions. Dentistry, you got to have the stomach for staffing here because we just tend to have a workforce here that tends to be very fluid, both in the front and in the back. I do have resources if you need some dental assistants, hygienists. That's not what we do here. But there are certainly things where I know the back office, the clinical aspect is a big stomach ache on its own. But you want to figure out ways and systems to be able to just create that continuity, whether or not someone's there, right? You want to just make sure your systems are set up to take advantage of both part-time and full-time team members. So just wrapping up, so I have a few minutes here at the end. Just to keep in mind, you'll see the impact in terms of your the hybrid model, usually over a longer period of time. Again, like I said, the first 30 days, typically you want to give it time to kind of pick up speed because you're also training, you're orienting your team member just like an employee. So you want to give it a little bit of time to kind of settle in, to kind of bake in, and then you start to build trust and synergy. But I don't want to rush it because I know that you guys are also busy. And to think that you're going to offload everything in one conversation to a remote professional, I think is a little silly. So you should take that pressure off yourself saying, hey, in the next 30 days, 60 days, we're going to slowly kind of really transition you and integrate you into our practice. So you want to give yourself, just a little bit of grace to be able to adequately onboard that team member. It's going to highlight weakness and strengths of your workflows. Again, a lot of my doctors didn't realize, like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know. We don't have a protocol for this, right? So now you have a team member in here and you're just understanding now where there are gaps in your workflows. Just take care of it. It's better to do it now versus later because, you're going to have to address it at some point. And you want to be aware of over rotation of specialized. And essentially what I mean by that is I did have one practice where it's like they had one person doing verification, one person inputting it, one person doing scheduling, one person doing crane. And it was like a $50,000 practice, but they had like 7 different people doing this one workflow. And it just got really difficult to manage because when something goes wrong, you're not quite sure who did it. So I like the model, but you don't necessarily need to go overboard. If you don't need to have so many people on there, you want to kind of figure out what the right blend is for your practice. So final thoughts, make sure you have the right people in the right seats before you do anything. And then be eager and open to experiment with this hybrid model. I think it's really exciting if you do it well. I mean, there's a ton of things. I think it will give you more joy in your practice. It'll give your team a little bit more breathing room. They can do the things that they love. You can maximize, obviously, your on-site team. And then lastly, I like to add this because there's a lot of DSOs, emerging groups kind of coming into private practice and the dentistry. And I think if you want to think like private equity, I encourage you to think about how they think about when they go into dentistry, which is you want to crystallize your value proposition. And what private equity does really well is they can understand what makes a business work, where they generate money, and they double down on it. And you can do the same thing. And the way that you do that is you think about, hey, in the next 5 years, how do I triple my business? And using the hybrid model, you can certainly do that. There's lots of help for you here. But that's kind of my talk for today. And I'm sorry, I wanted to give more time, but certainly I'm here. And again, your job is to make sure everything gets done, not do everything as I mentioned before. So hopefully this wasn't too overwhelming, but hopefully it gives you a new model to be able to come back to your practice. Know that if something goes wrong, at least in the front, at least I have your back. I'm certainly available to all of you. And I hope that you'll consider this model. I think there's some real promise to it. Here's my information. My cell phone is below. Please feel free to text me. I do check my email, but probably like your email, I get a ton of email. So, you know, I get text messages all the time. I welcome you to reach out to me. I'm here for you.